If we focus less on leaving a good impression and focus more on presenting the best impression of who we are, we stand a chance of then giving people the truest, most authentic picture of ourselves.
Harriet, thank you so much for joining me today. Could you introduce yourself to us?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Arit Okpo, and I am a number of things. I am a television presenter, I am a voiceover artist, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm a TV producer. I currently host CNN African Voices, which is a show that celebrates the work of Africans on the continent and in the diaspora doing really wonderful things. I love food. If you follow me on social media, you'll know that I am constantly either cooking something or talking about something I've eaten. And that is because for me, food is such a pure affection language. It's a pure love language, you know. You chop and you blend and you mix and you taste. And there's a lot of effort and for me a lot of heart that goes into making food, you know. So it's often an opportunity for me to come back to self, especially if I've had a very
Mm,
busy few
mm,
days or few weeks. I spend like a couple of days making the stuff I like to eat. It's for me a way to come back to self, to remind myself of all the ways that it's important to nourish not just my body, but my soul, and to do the things that make me happy and give me joy. So, yes, I have a very beautiful relationship with food.
yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what you say
Hmm.
about kind of coming back from a hard day and just wanting to make your favorite dishes. I think there's something very therapeutic in the
Hmm.
process of food and the love you put into it. I think it stems back from probably our culture in Nigeria, where food and spices and pepper, crayfish are so important in our dishes, and and the way in which those recipes are passed through generations,
Hmm.
and it's not necessarily in the form of a physical book. So there's a generational connection as well, and so
Hmm.
which takes me into your own life story. You're from Nigeria, I believe. Tell us
Oh,
about your
yes.
early years of Arit.
I am Nigerian, yes. I used to be a very curious child. I'm a curious adult. That hasn't changed at all. But I was one of those kids who was always so interested in the why of things. I started out in nursery school. Unfortunately, I went to one of those nursery schools where my talents were very nurtured. So I was always either doing a drama situation or I was doing a reading somewhere. And there was such easy affirmation with that I think I subconsciously absorbed that I was good at speaking and communicating. And then that came back into my life several years after. I studied biochemistry in the university because you know that thing that happens where if you have A's in certain number of courses, then obviously you're a science student. I don't think they
Yes.
calculated for people like me who knew just well how to cram. So I just crammed everything and gave it back on the exam sheets. So that gave the impression that I was a much better science student than I was in real life. So yes, I went into
Oh,
the
God.
university and studied biochemistry, which looking back at it now, it's such a surprise to me because I don't know how I thought that would be a career path. And yes, went from university into school administration, and in 2013 got an opportunity to be a TV host for Ebony Life TV, and I took it. That's the very condensed
Mm.
version, but yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, let's take a few steps back to those early kindergarten years. Tell us about those formative years, and at that point, did you did you have any early influences in terms of media, in terms of storytelling, and what you do today?
I didn't have what you would call conscious influences. I was just one of those kids who had a lot to say and was encouraged to say whatever I had to say. And you can't overstate how important that is as a child, that as a young one, their voice is heard and valued. I remember, for instance, us having to do a debate competition in my primary school, and my teacher wrote down my points and was like, here, take this home, memorize it for the quiz for the debate tomorrow. And I remember very distinctly saying to her, no, if I'm going to do a debate, I will come with my own points. I'm not memorizing your points. And this is a 7, 8 year old. I think I was probably around 7 then because I was in primary 3. But I remember that very clearly. And the teacher going, okay, you can't say enough how important it is for me as a 7 year old to have enough faith in my ability to communicate, that I was willing to say to the teacher, no, if these are the conditions to do this debate, then I'm not doing it, you know?
And what would you say gave you that sense of your voice? Would you say that was a natural thing, or would you say that was nurtured by your parent?
I would say it was a natural thing that was nurtured. Nobody ever told me, at least at that age, that I couldn't say what I wanted to say. That came much later in secondary school. But as a child, up to 9 years old, everybody just saw I was so brilliant and so smart and so well spoken.
Mm.
That definitely translated into how I engaged with adults, how I engaged in everyday life. I was always looking for a book to read. At 7 or 8 years old, I read Roots because it was in my father's library, and why not? So I think it was something that I started out with. My mom used to say, she still says, that my favorite question as a child was why. And the fact that I still ask why so much now as an adult says that that traveled from my childhood to my adulthood.
There's two things that you've meant there. I'm going to definitely explore your reflections on roots as a 7 year old, girl. But in terms of that question, that journey of being able to ask why, how important do you feel that is in terms of bringing up our children today?
Children should be encouraged to be as curious as possible and to have a sense of excitement and possibility about exploring that curiosity. And it's not just for career or for vocation, it's for them as individuals. There is a tendency, I think, in bringing up children on the continent where they are taught to respect authority and not so much question it. And so you see people in adulthood who see situations that are wrong and find ways to contort themselves to fit those situations rather than questioning why they should be the status quo. Why should I be in a work environment where my boss doesn't think it's okay to pay me as at when due, but expects me to submit my deliverables as expected? Why can't I question that? And if I question that, why am I afraid of punishment? You know, I think that children should be encouraged to be curious, to be confident in that not knowing is not a sin or a crime or a wrong, but it's an opportunity to learn. And, on one end, yes, you will see what they're interested in and you can nurture that as a parent. But you also bring up a child who's not afraid to challenge the status quo and who's not afraid to ask what happens if I do this, or where does this learning journey take me? Fostering that sense of curiosity, nurturing it, encouraging your child to go and find out and come back and tell you. These are all invaluable skills that children will take into adulthood as just part of who they are and not necessarily something that they are taught.
Yeah. And I mean, beyond the social benefits of those kind of curious minds, specifically for our industry, journalism, being
Mhm.
curious and being able to ask why and being able to question authority is part and parcel of the job.
Exactly. I'm somebody who's very interested in people. I'm very interested in the whys of why they do the things that they do. So even for me, whenever I have an opportunity to interview someone, it's an immersion into their life. It's an immersion into their choices, their paths, their decision making process. It's invaluable to be able to sit down. And this is not just a job for you. This is something you're doing because you're genuinely interested in taking this situation or this person apart and trying to make sense of it or them.
And you mentioned earlier on about reading Roots at the age of 7. Now, talk us through that. Like a 7 year old, you see this magnificent book called Roots and you decide to read it, you know, just bring us into your mind at that point and also your reflections on it and how you interpreted that story at that young age.
At that young age, I think it was possibly more for me about finding a book that was thick enough or challenging enough because I used to get a lot of nursery rhymes and so on, and I became a speed reader very quickly. So I would read a 100-page book in maybe a day or two. And Roots seemed hefty enough to engage my attention. I read it in a week, which is not a small feat for a
Wow,
7-year-old. I
it's not.
remember being very gripped by the story of when Kunta Kinte was captured. And that is the thing that stayed with me. I read it again when I was 12 or 13. That stayed with me. Just seeing the progression of people's lives and seeing how there's such a tragic loss of identity in the slavery story. And as a child,
Mhm.
seeing somebody going out to the farm, like, should have been normal for him and never going home, that probably would have stressed me out as a child. Just that idea of leaving my house and not coming back home to my mom.
Mhm.
But yes, that impacted very deeply on me, just the violence of that taking.
And I mean, these are topics that are still in discussion in the public sphere today. In the last few months, with the lockdown, we've had the situation in America and Black Lives Matter movements that has kind of even emerged in South Africa and globally. And so these questions of identity and the history around Black identity and the treatment of Black people globally is something that's currently in conversation. So, do these take you back to those things and those feelings you had back then when you read Roots?
I think I have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of the ways that racism manifests and the ways that structural racism ensures that people never rise above certain circumstances simply because the state has made it impossible for that to happen. That's probably as true for South Africa in certain ways as it is for the US. I think it has also shown me how much more I have to learn because I think that when you're an African who grows up in Africa, you approach conversations around racism from a very different perspective. And it's important to remember that we do not have the same experience. So for me, I think the biggest lesson has been how much I don't know, how important it is for me to listen and observe the lived experiences of African American people, and how important it is for me to not, in sharing my reality, discount the realities of others who have a much, much, much different perspective or experience of growing up. So if we're going to take it back to Kunta Kinte, I think, and Roots, I think for me, sitting down now and looking back at it, it's how that violence has continued, how
Mm.
in certain ways on paper things might have changed, but we still have situations even now where African American people are still fighting for basic rights in ways that are not as many of these ways are in the nuances of how the society is structured. It's heartbreaking, but it's also an opportunity for me as an African woman who grew up in Africa to watch and to learn and to approach from a place of a desire to understand.
Exactly, and I think even for me as an African in diaspora, I'm based in the UK. It's really made me to reflect on my position. We've got different experiences because of our background of living in an African
Mhm.
country, and you're only black because now I'm living in the UK. That kind of thing. And I think it's really, like you said, being sensitive to each other's histories and
Exactly.
learning and
Yes.
continuing that journey of learning. And for you, as somebody that produces such an important program as African Voices on CNN, how do you bring all of that together in the selection process and the construction of these narratives on that program?
Okay. I present African Voices. I have a really great producer called Earl Nurse who
Mm.
together, I think we do a pretty great job of highlighting stories. One of the things I feel that has been really important to me as host of the show is ensuring or doing my part to see that the stories that we tell are diverse. Because there is a tendency to think of Africa as this big monolith. And even when we're celebrated, it's often because of our music or because of our film industry or, things like that. But there are also people who are doing lots of things that might not be as dramatic in their visibility, but which are very important. Um, at the other end is sometimes that tendency to tell African stories from such a Western lens that it makes the ordinary exotic. And so, in the stories that we tell, I think that we're doing a great job, whether it's a Maasai warrior who is now a lion protector, or whether it's a Senegalese surfer who is wanting Olympic glory, or it's somebody in South Africa who's working with street kids. There's such a diversity of stories. And we work really hard to represent as much of that diversity as we can.
So earlier on, you were telling me that you studied biochemistry in university.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that. We have that story, don't we, in our Nigerian families where we're all forced into certain lines of profession. You're either a scientist, a lawyer, or a doctor, or you're simply a disappointment. So, so what was that journey like for you? And has that helped? As having that background also helped, having that degree in biochemistry?
It's so funny for me. So I was supposed to study medicine, of course. If you know that there was a generation of us that if we studied biochemistry or physiology or anatomy, you knew it was because we couldn't get into
Mm-hmm.
medicine. I was one of those. There's a little bit of a situation because my father used to be part of ASU when ASU was always striking. And so that might have played a part in my not getting admitted into medicine. But then I had a choice to study physiology or biochemistry. And I thought biochemistry looks like something I could, do more with. So I went into that. One of the things I will say is that I don't feel that learning biochemistry should have been as difficult as it was for me. It was very abstract. And I have come into myself now knowing that I'm somebody who really relies on concrete concepts and ideas for things to make sense to me. But the first 2 years, I really struggled. And then I kind of got my balance a bit in my third year and finished with a hopefully not too disgraceful result. But then I never did anything with the degree. And it makes me laugh because I grew up in Calabar. And when my family was moving to Abuja in, I want to say the year 2000 or so, my mom asked if I would consider starting again in another university and studying maybe English language or so. But I was going into my third year then, and it felt like such a waste. So I would just give up these 2 years that I've spent already
Mm.
and, and go and start again. And it's so funny that I thought that way because I was only 17. I got into university at 15. So
Wow.
I did have a lot of time, but you don't think like that as a teenager. And sometimes I wonder how different my journey would have been if I had said, yes, I would love an opportunity to start again and do something that I might actually enjoy. But then again, also,
Mm.
for some of us, our experience of school wasn't something that you enjoyed. It was something you went through so that you could get a degree. A lot of that influenced my decisions in university.
So you said you started university at 15, and that is a common thing with Nigerian families. I'm also seeing as well. I mean, I started university at 17, so
Mhm.
it's not that as young as you, but it's still quite an earlier age than most people would be. So
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
come?
I was one of those kids who I say that I started walking at, if I recall, I think I started walking at, it might have been 9 months or 10 months, and I didn't stop walking for a long time. I was one of
Mm,
those very precocious kids. So, for instance, you do nursery one, nursery two, then sometimes you have a transition class that prepares you for primary one. I skipped the transition class. Then I did primaries
okay.
one, two, three. And at the end of, I believe, primary four, I wrote my common entrance exam and I came sixth in my state. So I did pretty well. And that meant that I skipped primary one and primary five and primary six. I literally left for secondary school at the end of the first week of primary five, and I was 9 years old.
But what was that like for you as a 9 year old in secondary school, in a big, in a, in an environment where you're the youngest, there are people much older than you, and you're learning more advanced things than your age, and then also just emotionally.
I think academically was not as big a struggle as emotionally. Secondary school was a singularly unpleasant experience for me. I was bullied from JS1 to SS1. I was bullied by my classmates. I was bullied by senior students. I was an easy subject for bullying. And I think that is the thing that I I might have carried with me from secondary school. Just remember, I was this child who grew up in a nursery school where I was affirmed, everybody knew me, I was a little star, I was articulate, everybody wanted to hear what I had to say. To being in this situation where I was one of 40 from all around the country, and this system of bullying that was such a mainstay for many of us in that secondary school experience, I didn't have the smarts to evade or to hide, and I didn't have the strength then to push back. So it was horrible. I was always getting picked on. I was always getting goodness, it wasn't fun. I got mocked for everything.
Mm.
It took me from this child who was so unafraid to express herself to somebody who was just waiting for the next person who was going to come be nasty to me. And by SS2, I just wanted
I
to be
mean,
done.
bullying at it's never a good experience to have. And have you, beyond experiencing it at that age, have you experienced it professionally in your adult years, and how have you coped with it?
Unfortunately, some of my bosses were bullies, some more than others. One badly enough to where I think I would say she was, verbally and emotionally abusive as a boss. By the time I left that job, my confidence was so short that it took a while to get it back. And I could never really identify what the source of her animosity towards me was. Not to say that that was my responsibility to make sense of somebody else's
Yeah.
behavior, but I could never understand why I couldn't do anything right, you know? We would have staff meetings, and in a 3 hour staff meeting she would spend an hour to 2 hours detailing all the things I wasn't doing right, and that really affects your confidence. It makes you unable to trust your decision making process. Fortunately, I didn't stay with her very long, but it did have an influence on me, and also I hope impacted how I engaged with my subordinates in then more structured work environments.
And how did you cope though? Do you feel that you coped within that time, or did the coping and the kind of getting through it come afterward?
Earlier on, I talked about how, as people in a work environment, we're not taught to question people's behavior or to say this person's behavior isn't right. So, a lot of it for me was what are the things I need to do so that for whatever task I have to do next, I don't get bullied. It then became for me a survival game. But the problem with that
Yeah.
was that the things that caused her to lash out at me were so varied and so dispersed in identity that I could never quite figure out what I needed to do to fix things. And it was the most random things. It would be like everybody in the office could call her by her first name, but I had to call her Madame, you know? My motivation changed from doing a good job to doing what I had to do to not get yelled at, which
Exactly.
is a different
Exactly.
approach to work
Exactly.
entirely.
And for you as a person, how did you rebuild your? I mean, like you said, it absolutely isn't up to the person that's been bullied to make sense of the bully's action or to adjust yourself to suit the bully's action. And, you must have gone through a process of regaining yourself perhaps after you left the job. So, what for those listeners who are going through this or who have experienced bullying and still figuring it out, what would be your advice to them?
The first thing I would say, and I'm saying a lot of this in hindsight because obviously I didn't have the scope or awareness then that I do now,
Yeah.
is that number one, it is bullying. It's not you being inefficient. It's not you being, incapable. Even if you're not doing 100% on your job, there have to be ways to correct that do not take away your sense of self. So own that first and foremost. I am being bullied, because that shifts the responsibility from you and puts it on the person who's actually doing the bullying. I would say if you can find another job, do so immediately, as soon as you can. And I understand that job opportunities are not abundant. But in that case, try to create coping mechanisms. If there's an ally who's senior to the person that you are dealing with, then see if you can talk to them and maybe get transferred. Some bullies will back off if you stand up to them, but you have to be careful with that, because you don't also want to risk a job that you can't afford to lose. It was important for me also to be able to identify, for instance, facts that many of the things I was asked to do in that job role, I was not trained for. So many of the times that I was being yelled at for doing something wrong, I hadn't been given the tools to do it right. It was also important for me to literally sit down and say, Arit, task A, you do that well. Task B, you do that well. So with all the resources I had, did I do the best I could? Yes. And I had to sit with that and allow it to become true for me. That Arit, there was so much about this that wasn't about you or anything you were doing or not doing. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely does. And for those in positions of authority who are behaving in these kind of manners, what advice would you give to them? What would be your, conversation with them?
I don't I honestly don't know that I have much to say apart from, you're a bully and you need to check that. You need to ask yourself why it's okay to speak to subordinates or employees in ways that you would not be spoken to, or you wouldn't speak, to people who are your peers. I do understand that there are hierarchies in work environments, but there is also dehumanizing another person because it satisfies something that is lacking within yourself. So I don't know that I would have a
Mm.
conversation as much as just say you're a bully and you need to stop that.
Well, I mean, this is bullying is such a big issue that we experience at different points in our lives. I was bullied in school, and
Mhm.
experienced bullying in various other environments. And no matter how strong you feel you are, it's still a bully would always be a bully kind
Hmm.
of thing, and you
Hmm.
still have to confront people in different ways. And particularly in your media work, is this something you encounter a lot in media?
I have been fortunate in certain ways to work in spaces where I had either enough space or enough support to get my work done without too much interference. So for me, I would say that once I started working in media, it was a different experience, and that came with its own set of challenges. But bullying per se, fortunately for me, like I work in currently now in a workplace where we have conversations about work. And with bosses before that, I have mostly been engaged with as somebody who had skill. And that carries its own kind of validation that guides how people engage with you. So if people assume you're an expert, they will treat you as an expert, or they will treat you with a certain amount of regard. Initially, it wasn't, I mean, I had one supervisor who wasn't very helpful, but actual bullying, fortunately, I haven't experienced that.
So, well, talking about the media, tell us about your first media job. So, you've done this biochemistry degree at university. How then did you
Hmm.
transition from that into
It was
media?
two things. So there's this very, very wonderful friend and mentor that I used to have, that I have, called Deji Arosho. And Deji worked with the BBC a long time ago. But on his own, he was a film producer. He was a freelance producer. No, actually, he left the BBC and became a freelance producer. And so whenever he had work to do, he would ask me to come along with him as an associate producer. And we did a project in, I want to say, in Port Harcourt, yes, where we were working with young militants to teach them how to tell their stories through documentary filmmaking. So that was like a very intensive immersion into the production process. Then in 2010, I believe, I went in for a reality show called The Debaters. And it was one of those things where, you stand up. It's a debate show. It was a
Mm-hmm.
very valuable learning experience for me because of like the research and the confidence and the public speaking skills. But one of the reasons why the judges kept having to critique my work was that they said I was too conversational. They're like, this is a debate show. You're supposed to be an orator. You're giving us conversations. And in that context, it was probably part of the reason why I didn't win. But 3 years later, the executive producer of the debaters, who was Mo Abudu, was setting up Ebony Live TV. And she remembered me because that's one of the incredible things about MA is that she will have an encounter with you, and 5 years later, if there's a slot for you that fits, she will call you. She has an excellent memory for
Mm.
talent. And so she said to me, Arit, I'm starting a new channel. We need a news anchor. We need a current affairs show. And I've always thought about the way you debated and that conversational style. And I think you would be an asset to us. Would you like to come and do a screen test? And at that point, I was getting ready to transition from my school administrator job. I knew that I wanted to do a little bit more, but I didn't know whether I needed to change my job location or I needed to change my career path. I had put down film school as one of the things I drew this entire, I'm not joking, like this 50-year plan or something like that,
Oh God,
or a 25-year
50
plan.
year
It
plan.
was a 25, I think it
Wow,
was
that's
25 years ahead. It did see me into my 50s. And I had just sat down and drawn this very complicated plan. And I was trying to explore my options when this job offer came in. And there was such a rightness about it. So I flew to Calabar. I did my screen test. And Emma is like, so when can you start? I'm like, I need to go and give my notice. And so I came back, I rounded up in Abuja, and then I moved to Calabar to start as the news and political, like the more serious things, the presenter for the more serious subjects. And that's how that journey started.
That's interesting. I mean, there's two key things I picked up from what you said in terms of that story. First of all, about leaving a good impression. So the fact that Mo Abudu remembered you was because of the way in which you presented yourself in that particular job. So tell us about that, about the idea of kind of leaving that impression and owning who you are so that others remember you.
I think that many times when we think about leaving a good impression, we think about it as like window dressing. In other words, we think, what are the things I need to do in this space that will make people remember me? The problem with that is that if there is no authenticity with that, you then are building an identity that isn't true. And I feel like that can become a prison in its own way. For me, the probably one of the biggest successes of my career, particularly in media, is that I have always shown up. I know what my strong points are. I know that I'm a relatable brand. I know that I'm somebody people feel like they know. I know, for instance, that the people who take my career successes like I'm their sister or their cousin or their neighbor that they grew up with. That is the uniqueness, I think, of my brand. And the reason why it fits so well is because that is who I am. I'm the kind of person who, when you meet, we can sit down and have a chat, and it feels like we've known each other for ages. So if I tried to be anything or anyone other than that, it wouldn't fit because I would have to learn how to be somebody that I'm not. So going back to your question, I think that if we focus less on leaving a good impression and focus more on presenting the best impression of who we are, we stand a chance of then giving people the truest, most authentic picture of ourselves. Because if I had walked into that space wanting to learn to be an orator, and I did want to learn to be an orator, but I also at some point realized that I could do better building points that buttressed my style. And I think that's why she remembered me. So in spaces, you need to identify the thing that makes you special and how to present it to its best in that space. Don't think, oh, because I want to work in media and everybody in media looks like this, so I have to look like that. No. What is the best version of yourself that you can build? Not put on like it's a garment or like it's a cloak, but you build it. You become better by the day. I'm much better now than I was 5 years ago. I was thinking the other day about how naive I was 5 years ago. And I can't imagine how fantastic I'll be in 5 years. So my intention is always to do better for myself as myself. It's about identifying your best points, your they call them your selling points, and asking yourself how best you can present those points in these contexts. So it's always you.
And essentially remaining your authentic self.
As much as you can, yes.
And the second thing that I picked up from your earlier conversation was around this your 25-year plan. So I know we made a whole joke about it because 25 years, wow.
I know.
But planning is important, isn't it? Talk us through like your life planning and how you find that process of reflecting and auditing and developing a plan to the implementation and kind of revisiting your plan. Do you do that as this 25-year plan? As it happened, how has it changed over the years?
You know, let me see. The truth about it is that plan lasted about 3 months.
Like
Because
many plans before
you
it is
you
done.
know, I was so clear about what I was going to do. And 3 months later, my whole life had changed. And I think for me, that was the biggest lesson. It's not about not planning, but it's about recognizing that you change. There are people I know who are very clear about what their goals are. In 3 years, I'm going to do this. In 5 years, and that's a separate kind of person. I'm not that person. I think my life journey has been more about me identifying opportunities that are right for me and then getting, I would say I have a more general picture of what my future looks like. There is a life that I would like in if the next few years, but I'm not so tied to the path to it that I will not recognize when opportunities come. That 25-year plan, I mean, I laugh at it now, but I think perhaps plans show you what's important.
Exactly. Change and flexibility and being able to be responsive.
I think that plans tell you what's important to you and they tell you what your core needs are. But yes, I definitely think that we should stay open and every so often audit. And like you said, ask yourself, do these things that I wanted still apply? Because if you want the same things now that you wanted 5 years ago, maybe you're not allowing yourself to explore all the new opportunities that the past 5 years have opened up to you, you know? So, I mean, planning is
Exactly.
great if that's your thing, but just be open and be flexible and allow life to surprise you.
Exactly. So now, so you got that huge surprise call from the fantastic Mo Abudu. What was that like working with Mo at Ebony Life TV?
I think Mo is one of the most incredible human beings I have ever worked with. Literally, she used to do this thing that was the most. I would send, so first, everything that went on air, Mo had to see it because she would be like, this is my name, this is my reputation. So if we were piloting a new show or working on a new concept or we had a special episode, she had to see it. And I remember one night, because I'm a nocturnal person, I tend to work more at night. I remember one night I sent her an outline for something at around 1 a.m. And, I'm tidying up, putting things away. And then I get a notification about 20 minutes later. And it was more with feedback, literally saying, oh, great job. At 4 minutes, 35 seconds, there's a brush against the screen. Check what that was. It might have been something flying past. At this and this time, why don't you cut straight to this? And she had given me such detailed feedback because that is who she is. She would give us creative freedom. So when I started, she literally said to me, I want to create a good news show. You have 3 months to make this happen. Best of luck, you know? And
Mm.
I had to go off and create an identity for the show, create the concepts, bank the content, and then go back to her and be like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? There's something about working with somebody that has such huge standards for themselves because it challenges you to interrogate the standards that you have for yourself. So if she's going to take your work apart and look at it minute by minute and give you feedback, then you owe it to yourself and to her to make sure that that first draft that she gets is as good as you can make it. So that what she's giving you feedback on is based on her experience, not your laziness or your lack of care, you know?
So you would say that having people like Mo and other people who are doing amazing things in media as mentors, visible, is a really important thing as part of your own journey.
It's important. It's always important to have people who are achieving, who are, and not just achieving in the material senses of being visibly successful. But when you have an idea about how people work, it encourages you to explore how you work and how you can do better. And I think that Mo is so significant because she's a woman in the media space who started as a talk show host and, has continued to innovate and expand. And she's very open about her challenges. She's very open about her dreams and aspirations. So it also encourages you to look at growth and success as something much more multi-layered and nuanced than, oh, I worked hard and I achieved it. There's a lot that goes into everything that we do. There's a lot that goes into our outcomes, which is why like this podcast you're doing is so important, because it encourages us to explore the details of people's journeys and not just assume that all there is what you can see.
And so, how long were you at Ebony TV, and where did you move on from there?
I was at Ebony Life for about 2.5 years, I say. I started there in August 2013. I left December 2016. And then I worked for myself for a while. And in that time, I started to host a web talk show called Untold Facts, which is executive produced by the Initiative for Equal Rights. And it explores the realities and the experiences of LGBT people in Nigeria. And that was also a very important growth and learning experience for me. I still host it. We're getting ready to shoot season 5, I believe. So there was that. And then I started doing voice work. I also was hosting events. I was moderating panels, really building my skills in those areas. And then I got the opportunity to do voice work, to be the voice of African voices. I did that for about a year.
Before we move on to that, just hold on to
Yes.
that thought. Let's go back to you starting your own work as a media entrepreneur now, right?
Yes.
And then also the specific topic of focusing on LGBT rights in Nigeria, an environment where that must have been a very difficult conversation to be having publicly, right? So tell us about that journey of establishing your own media organization and in terms of this particular topic on LGBT rights in Nigeria.
I knew that I wanted to explore the ways that I could be in media. And I knew that I could do that most effectively for that time working for myself. So, for instance, I love to make documentaries, and I love to make documentaries about social justice or about gender, things like that. So, working for myself gave me an opportunity when I wasn't trying to survive to identify the things that I was passionate about and the ways that I wanted to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. Untold Facts was a blessing because the then executive director of Tears got in touch with me, and he was like, "Oh, we're looking to have a new host. Are you interested?" And I was like, "Yes." It's a very significant job for me because I know that I have a lot of media credibility, and I have the opportunity to use this voice and this goodwill that I have and the credibility that I have to talk about something that's very important. When we talk about LGBT realities in Nigeria or on the continent, there's a very big tendency to other. So even when people are sympathetic, there is a bias that ends up othering the people that you're telling the stories of. You tend to focus on their difference from the quote unquote mainstream rather than humanizing those stories and telling LGBT stories from the perspective of we are all human. If I'm talking about human rights abuses for LGBT people, I'm talking about it as the inability of state agencies to acknowledge that LGBT rights are human rights. I'm talking about it within the context of the fact that we tend to have a human rights problem on the continent. I'm talking about it from the perspective of everybody deserves to feel respected and to have recourse if their rights are affected. And this is a population that does not have that. It's one of the biggest privileges I have that Tears trusts me consistently to be able to present these conversations and these topics. And
Mm.
I am constantly challenged to be honest and at the same time to be human, to remind people that there are human beings. You think of gay people and you think of them as this abstract, but they're people who, they have jobs, they lose jobs, they
Yeah.
go out on Fridays, they fall in love, they have breakups. And we need to examine how we tell LGBT stories, and we need to ensure that we do not further reinforce the mentality that these are others
Yeah.
in our storytelling, especially when you work in the media.
Yeah, exactly. You spoke about hosting events. So did that all come out at the same time within you developing this media company and the experiences you were having in hosting the talk show?
No, no, no. I had actually started getting invitations to host events while I still worked at Ebony Live TV. And that continued after I left. I focused mostly on corporate events because, again, that's my area of strength. That's how that came about.
Tell us about the journey in getting to African Voices on CNN.
So I got an opportunity to do the voiceover work for a documentary called Swallow, which was executive produced by the Yaradua Foundation. And the producer of that had me come over to the studio. We recorded for about 2 hours, and he was quite happy with it. And then a couple of months later, he sends a message to me and he says, Arit, the producer of African Voices is looking for a voiceover person. So I've sent him your email address. Audition if you can. And I was like, oh, okay. So I auditioned, and the producer was like, your voice, you are exactly what we're looking for. So I started doing voice work then, and I became the voice of African Voices. There was a period where there was no host, and it was mostly my voice then that you would hear. And that has
Mm-hmm.
also been a very valuable learning experience for me. And then after a year or so,
Yeah.
he says to me, I saw some of your TV work on the internet. And I said, yes, I'm a TV presenter too. He's like, would you like to do a screen test for this job? I was like, yes. So, so I went ahead, I did the screen test, and they liked it. And then I was officially announced as the host. And that's what I've been doing now since last year. So I'm both the face
That's
and the voice of African Voices.
how has that journey been though? The responsibility of doing such a program where you're literally in charge of exposing narratives about Africa, putting together stories about Africa internationally. What's that responsibility like for you, and what's that journey been like for you?
One of the things that it has become very clear that I have to think about is what our stories look like for an audience that isn't composed solely of us. If I'm telling stories for an African audience, there are things I don't have to explain beyond the superficial. I can connect enough similarities in our stories to tell something that somebody from another country would understand. Because, I know how to pull the nuances of our identities, the similarities of our identities, so that the things then that we don't know are probably not as many as the things that we do know. It's a different story when you're telling stories for an international audience, because there are people that don't have your context. They don't automatically understand why this is such a big deal or why this way of telling stories is so unique. So for instance, let's take that Maasai warrior who has become a like a lion protector. I mean, on one hand, you're thinking, if you're an international person, you're probably thinking, oh, this is really cute and so on and so forth. But the Maasai warriors also have a long established relationship because of their nomadic existence, a not always friendly relationship with lions. And so when you have a Maasai warrior, Samburu warrior, who then decides that he's going to protect lions and teach his community how to protect these lions, and that there's potential in tourism for the planet and so on in protecting lions, there's a much deeper context if you're from Kenya, because you know what that means, you know how big a deal it is. So for me, it has been interrogating my stories to ensure that I can acknowledge that people who are not here don't always understand why it's such a big deal that these stories are being told, but also to tell them, like I said earlier, in a way that doesn't then make these stories exotic. The Kenyan surfer who is running for Olympic gold is special because she comes from a surfing family. The Senegalese surfer, sorry, she comes from a surfing family. Surfing is something that's becoming quite popular on the western coast, but she's also a woman, and she was challenged to find something more quote unquote feminine. And then she has this African American mentor who wants to help her. And so it's a multi layered story. And I find myself working harder to present those layers in a way that is respectful and a good description.
And so for all the kind of journalists and hosts and presenters like yourselves who are constructing African narratives for international audiences, what would be that advice you'd give to them in terms of that responsibility of managing the narrative of Africa?
I would say first, remember that there isn't one narrative. Remember that you are telling a narrative. So even in presenting these stories, especially when you're presenting for an international audience, be sure that you are not presenting your experience as this universal African experience that is often so exoticized. But you also then have an opportunity to decide on the lens with which you will tell these stories. So remember to humanize the context that you are sharing. Remember to emphasize that these are the stories of people with with hopes and dreams and a variety of realities. My friend Wana recently had a podcast interview, and she's a journalist and a writer, and she talked about not writing certain stories anymore because she realized that when she had the opportunity to write development stories, there was a lot more interest than if she was telling everyday stories. And so she made a decision to stop telling certain kinds of stories because she realized that the interest was in presenting African stories in a certain way. So, to the extent that you have agency to define storytelling, you should work as hard as you can to tell those stories and to tell them in a way that acknowledges that there's more than one way to be African, but that all those ways are valid.
And also, I mean, you mentioned earlier on about, working for an international organization and making sure that you're not again being filtered in the way in which you construct your stories to suit that Western narrative as well. I recently did a piece of research looking at how gender rights and women's rights in Africa is represented in Western media, and which
Mhm.
is an area of research that is still largely untouched. And it
Mhm.
was interesting for me to find that in the representation of women's rights in Africa by a particular media organization that I focused on,
Mhm.
it was always used in the context of trying to drive home the narrative of how poor the governments are in those countries.
Mhm.
So it's interesting when you bring it all together that there's
Mhm.
actually a singular narrative that's being pushed
Yes.
through these bigger stories, and how narrow the perspective of what it means, what women's rights issues are in Africa is in
Mhm.
Western media
Mhm.
that do not actually reflect the real day-to-day concerns of women in African countries.
Mhm.
So I think there's a huge responsibility there to not just change the narrative, but to develop new narratives to ensure that there is that multi-layered understanding of the various narratives that exist in our context.
It's so important. And I'm very fortunate I work with a really great producer. And he's traveled to many of the countries on the continent in the course of his work. So he has a pretty good understanding. So even when we're doing episodes or we're discussing interview questions and so on, I can see how good it is that I'm working with somebody who, even just like humorously, when we were doing the Yvonne Orji interview, and he was laughing. He was like, "Gosh, how did she deal with all the traffic?" And we had this because she was doing quite a lot of shooting and moving around and so on. And at some point, she has this interview, and he's like, she must have had mobile security because it's very rare to have this kind of space in this interview, for this interview. But the fact that he can acknowledge, he knows a lot, some of the nuances, because he's been here. He's been doing African Voices for about 10 years now. He's been doing it for a long time. So it's great that I don't have to often explain as many things as I ordinarily would. And I can't say how much of a gift it is to work with somebody who honors your experience and your existence and your storytelling. He'll be like, "What do you think about this? What's a good question to ask about this context?" And we go back and forth, and it makes such a difference.
And with all your achievements, I find it so hilarious that you call yourself a socially adept introvert. Really? Are
I
you really an
am.
introvert?
Oh
And
goodness, I am.
how have you coped with such a public life being an introvert?
It has been a learning experience for me, but it has also challenged me again because let me see, I'm committed to authenticity. Whatever the future
Yeah,
has for me, I have to be in the public eye as myself. I can't do it any other way. And so, I'm also learning, for instance, that when I'm outside or I'm working, then I can immerse myself totally in being. That's why I said I'm socially adept because I know how to switch on, my outdoor energy and engage and interact. But after that, I'm going to shut down for like 3 days and not want to talk to anybody. So it's learning how to share parts of myself, but still keep the core of myself to myself because I belong first and foremost to myself, and I must honor that. So it's learning how to be present and to acknowledge. I mean, it's a big deal for people to DM you and want to talk to you and want to engage with you or want you to attend their events and so on and so forth. It's a big deal. But I want to always do them from a place of, or interact or engage or honor these invitations from a place of centeredness. And I need to recognize, for instance, when an opportunity is not a good fit for me, when an outing is not a good time because I'm still in my hermit phase and I really, really just need to be indoors with myself right now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I
so
feel you.
yes, it's a learning process, both for what I need and how to engage with people in a way that honors their interest, but still honors my boundaries.
Thank you so much, Harriet. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Do you have any final words to add?
My final words would be that, no journey is easy, especially when you want to grow. There's no journey that is easy, but you can find joy in doing them. You can take these opportunities and this journey as a chance to learn about yourself as well as the work that you're doing. I would say that there's no one way to be in the media, and that sometimes it's possible to focus so much on somebody's career path that you might miss your own journey or your own path. So, by the same measure, there's no one way to be a success. The question I find valuable in asking myself is, am I doing the things that say success to me? If no, what do I need to do? If yes, how can I keep doing it better? I will say that it's possible to work hard and not be seen or valued or affirmed, but that doesn't mean that your work is not important. So, at the core of it, you must always understand the why of why you are in media and why the things you are doing are important to you. And then let your career journey be an exploration and a sharing of that why.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.